July 4th, 1857. It is midday in the 5 Points of Lower Manhattan, and the air is already heavy with tension. In the middle of the street, a dead rabbit is fixed onto a sharpened spike and lifted high above the crowd, almost like a battle standard, marking the beginning of war. Before any clear violence is seen, the sound arrives first. Iron striking cobblestone, stones ripped from the streets and thrown through the air, and the rising noise of men preparing for conflict. From Mulberry Street, the dead rabbits surge forward in large numbers. From Orange Street, the Bowery Boys advance to meet them head-on. What unfolds over the next 2 days transforms this corner of New York City into something resembling a medieval battlefield rather than a modern urban street. By the end of the violence, 8 men are dead, nearly 100 are severely wounded, and around 1,000 people have taken part in the fighting. Despite the scale of destruction, the police are unable to bring the situation under control. This is not because they are absent, but because the city itself is divided. In 1857, New York operates with 2 competing police forces that barely cooperate with each other, making any coordinated response nearly impossible. However, the riot itself cannot be understood as simple chaos. It is the result of deep and long-building social pressure between 2 very different communities. On one side, Irish Catholic immigrants who arrived in large numbers after escaping famine in their homeland. Many of them live in extreme poverty, packed into overcrowded tenements, struggling to survive in a city that often treats them with hostility. On the other side are native-born Protestant workers who see themselves as the original citizens of the city and view immigration as a direct threat to their jobs, neighborhoods, and identity. Most people today recognize this era through films and dramatized versions of gang violence in New York. While those portrayals capture the atmosphere, they often fail to show the deeper historical structure beneath it. What happened in the 5 Points was not just street fighting. It was the early formation of organized crime and political power systems that would later define urban America. To understand how this developed, it is necessary to look at the 5 Points itself. This neighborhood was formed where 5 narrow streets met in Lower Manhattan: Anthony Street, Cross Street, Orange Street, Little Water Street, and Mulberry Street. It was a small geographic area, but it became one of the most densely populated and socially complex places in the city. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland experienced one of the most devastating famines in European history. Around 1 million people died, and another million were forced to leave the country. A significant number of these immigrants arrived in New York with nothing but basic belongings and extreme desperation. Upon arrival, many were pushed into overcrowded boarding houses and tenements, often controlled by people who exploited their vulnerability. The 5 Points became one of the few districts where these immigrants could survive, even under harsh and unstable conditions. At the center of this environment stood one of the most infamous buildings in New York history, known as the Old Brewery. Originally constructed in 1792 as a brewery, it failed as a business and was later converted into a residential tenement. By the 1830s and 1840s, the Old Brewery housed as many as 1,000 people at any given time. Entire families lived in cramped, dark, and unsanitary rooms. Crime, disease, and violence were constant parts of life. Reports from the time even suggested that murders occurred there frequently, though such claims were likely exaggerated. Still, the fact that these rumors were widely believed reflects the extreme reputation of the building. When the Old Brewery was demolished in 1852, workers reportedly discovered human remains within its structure, adding to its already dark legacy. Whether every detail is fully accurate or not, the building became a symbol of the conditions that defined the 5 Points. Living in such an environment shaped the behavior and choices of its residents. For many young men, joining a gang was not simply a lifestyle decision. It was a way to survive, gain protection, and establish identity in a place where formal systems offered little support. From this environment emerged groups such as the Dead Rabbits. Originally linked to earlier street gangs, they grew into one of the most powerful Irish gangs in New York by the 1850s. Their name carried meaning in the streets, symbolizing strength, loyalty, and territorial control. Opposing them were the Bowery Boys. Unlike the immigrant-based gangs, the Bowery Boys were native-born Protestant workers, including butchers, laborers, and volunteer firefighters. They saw themselves as defenders of the city's original identity and were closely aligned with the Know Nothing movement, a political organization that promoted anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic ideology. This meant that gang conflict in the streets was directly connected to political conflict in the city. The Know Nothing movement was not marginal. It held political offices and influenced elections. The Bowery Boys functioned as both street enforcers and political supporters of this ideology. Within this environment, two major figures rose to prominence: William Poole and John Morrissey. William Poole, widely known as Bill the Butcher, was born in New Jersey in 1821. His early life as a butcher contributed to both his nickname and his physical strength. He became known as a powerful bare-knuckle fighter in New York's underground fighting scene, and eventually emerged as a leading figure of the Bowery Boys. Poole was feared, but also strangely admired. Even his enemies described him as highly charismatic. He understood that power was not only about physical violence, but also about presence, reputation, and performance. In a time before mass media, this kind of personal influence carried enormous weight. On the opposing side was John Morrissey, born in Ireland in 1831 and brought to America as a child. He grew up in poverty, but gradually built a reputation as a fighter and later became a heavyweight boxing champion. His success in boxing elevated him into political and criminal circles. Morrissey eventually became connected to Tammany Hall, the powerful political machine that effectively controlled New York City politics during the 19th century. Tammany Hall operated through a system of exchange where gangs delivered votes and political support in return for jobs, protection, and contracts. Election fraud, including multiple voting and identity switching, became part of this system. Politics and street gangs were deeply connected, functioning as two parts of the same structure. At the top of this system stood William Boss Tweed, who by the 1860s had taken control of Tammany Hall and effectively controlled the city itself. Through widespread corruption in public contracts and construction projects, massive amounts of public money were diverted. However, this system was not purely destructive. It also provided essential services to immigrant communities who had no access to formal support. It helped people find housing, employment, and legal assistance, creating a complex mixture of corruption and social welfare. This balance between exploitation and support is what allowed the system to survive for so long. The rivalry between Poole and Morrissey represented the deeper conflict within the city. It was not only personal, but symbolic of the broader struggle between native-born Protestants and Irish immigrants. Their hostility reflected the larger social division shaping New York at the time. This conflict reached its peak in 1855 inside a Broadway saloon. A confrontation escalated, and a member of Morrissey's circle shot William Poole in the chest at close range. Although Poole initially survived and attempted to fight back, the injury proved fatal. He died days later at the age of 33. His funeral drew thousands of mourners and became a major public event in New York City. His final words, reportedly declaring himself a true American, were widely circulated and became part of political mythology. Despite the public attention, no one was ever convicted for his murder. Morrissey himself later went on to serve as a member of the United States Congress, highlighting how closely crime and political power were intertwined. By 1863, New York City faced another explosion of violence during the draft riots. The federal government had introduced a military draft for the Civil War, but wealthier citizens could pay a fee to avoid service. This created deep resentment among working-class communities, particularly Irish immigrants, who saw the system as unjust. The riots quickly escalated into widespread destruction across the city. Draft offices were attacked, police were beaten, and violence spread throughout multiple neighborhoods. Tragically, the anger also turned toward black residents of the city, resulting in lynchings, arson, and the destruction of entire communities, including the burning of the colored orphan asylum. Federal troops were eventually deployed to restore order, marking one of the most violent civil disturbances in American history. Despite the scale of this unrest, the political machine survived and even strengthened. It presented itself as the only force capable of controlling and managing such a volatile population. In the years that followed, the world of the 5 Points did not disappear. It evolved. The gangs, political systems, and immigrant networks gradually transformed into more organized criminal structures that influenced later figures such as Paul Kelly, Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, and Lucky Luciano. These later criminal organizations inherited the same foundation: territorial control, political connections, and organized violence. Eventually, the physical neighborhood of the 5 Points was demolished. In its place came civic buildings, courts, and public parks. The original streets were erased, but the systems that were born there continued in different forms. Even today, echoes of that structure can still be seen in political machines, organized crime networks, and systems where power is built through loyalty, control, and exchange. Because what began in the 5 Points was never just a local story of gangs, it became the blueprint for how power itself could operate in urban America. If you want more deep dives into hidden worlds like this, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.